Today we're going to be creating heads-up display elements in Fusion from scratch, and next week I'm going to have a video talking about how we can use these to create the classic Iron Man helmet display. You definitely don't want to miss that video. These heads-up display elements are going to be really adaptable, and not only will I be showing you the tools you need to create these elements, but I'll also be teaching you some of the important techniques you need to get really good-looking designs. Then you can take what you learn, create your own elements, and even create other motion graphics in Fusion. This stuff does not just apply to heads-up display elements. I also have a pack of 50 pre-made elements I put together for just $5. I'll talk more about that later, but for now, let's hop into DaVinci Resolve and get started. The first design that we want to create is a circle effect. It's one of the most easily recognizable and arguably coolest elements in the films. For most of our designs, we're going to be using the shape system since it gives us great quality, plenty of options, and it renders fast. Now, when I approach designing stuff like this, I always start with the simplest possible spot. Then it's really easy to take that, adapt it, and build off of it to get what you're looking for. In Fusion, using the Shift Space keyboard shortcut, we're going to add in a S ellipse and then a S render node right after that. I'm going to connect our S render into the media out, and inside the ellipse, we do not want this to be solid, and we want to give this a nice thin border. For most circle elements, you want to have all or most of the circle visible. For this one, we're not going to modify it at all, and now we have our starting point for the graphic. My favorite way to make these look more futuristic and less boring is just to add in some custom accents around the circle, and the easiest way to do this is using a S polygon node. Let's make some room here, do Shift Space and add in a S polygon that we can then merge up into the S ellipse node. We're going to zoom into the circle and add in a point. And then I don't want to come straight out. I want to add a little bit of an angle to this accent. So I'll add another point, zoom back out, and find the spot on the circle that I want this accent to stop. In this case, let's make it a bit of a long one. So we're going to have it come right down here. So I want to go about the same distance away from the circle as the first point, add in a point, make that angle again, and then I'm going to come all the way back up and close this polygon off. Now, this is clearly not what we're going for. So let's come in, click on these points, and then grab these handles to match the curve of the circle. This outside one is really easy. You should be able to do that in just a couple of clicks. But this inside one is a lot harder to do because we can't line it up with anything. And this brings me to one of those cool tricks that we can use when making motion graphics, and that is adding in some sort of alignment shape. That's just a temporary thing that we can delete later on. Since we want to align it to the circle, we're going to add in a S ellipse to use as our alignment shape. Let's just connect this into the background, and what we want to do is shrink this down so it's just a little bit smaller than our original point. Then I want to come up to the style and bring the opacity down just so it's a little bit easier to see. Now we want to go back to the S polygon node and make sure all the way around this accent there is the same little gap that we created here. This will take some fine tuning to get it just right, but trust me, this is way easier than just trying to eyeball it without this temporary shape. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can see that it's not exactly the same distance all along here, but when I take away that reference shape, you can't tell the difference. It's going to be totally fine. So let's take this a step further, clicking on our S polygon node. And I want to add in another accent on the outside of the circle that's just protruding from the other side. To do this, we're going to add in a few points. We're going to add in 2 right there, come down here a little ways, and add in 2 spaced about the same distance apart. Now we can select those 2 points in the middle and then just drag this up whatever distance we want. The issue that this creates is it adds in a curve to our polygon, and we want this to be straight just like it is for the other one. To fix that, let's select these points, and up at the top we can hit this straight line, which will just straighten those curves out. And now when we zoom out, you can see we have this little accent protruding, and it looks really good. One thing to keep in mind is S polygon nodes always animate themselves. So if I were to go somewhere else in the screen and make a change, say I wanted this to be a little bit taller, what it's going to do is actually animate that so it changes over time. So go back to the original keyframe and right click down at the bottom and then do remove S polygon 1 polyline. That's going to get rid of that animation so you can change it at any point in the composition and you're not going to run into any issues. Now what we want to do is reconnect this reference shape and add in a few more accents around the circle just to give it some more variation. Alright, and once you're done adding in a few more of those, you already have a great base for a HUD circle element. But we have a lot of other tools in the shape system and some cool stuff that we can do to take this to another level. I want to add in a bunch of dots to the inside of the circle that just follow the path going all the way around. As you would expect for this, we're going to be using a S ellipse node. Instead of connecting this into the main merge, we're going to grab this and move it all to the side and add in another merge node. While this is just a great way to stay organized, the main reason that we're doing this will become a little more obvious soon, but essentially we want to keep different elements separated from each other. This first merge node is going to have everything from the outer circle, and then then the next one is going to add on another element to that. All right, so we want to make this dot really small. And instead of grabbing the viewer controls or trying to make sure that these match, let's use the old expression trick, right-clicking on height, going down to expression, grabbing this pick whip tool and dropping it on the width. Now these two controls are going to be linked, so we can drag this down and get really precise adjustments by clicking in the text box. Then we're going to move this dot up to the top, and to make it so it follows the path of the circle and adds in a bunch of them, we're going to be using a duplicate node. So we can add that in using shift space. And this node allows us to set the amount of copies up at the top here, but as I drag this up, nothing is actually going to change. And what you would want to do is change the Z rotation so that way it'll rotate around the circle. But again, when I do that, nothing actually changes. The reason for this is that its pivot point is right in the center of the circle. So there's actually 8 other circles here that we just can't see. To fix this, what we need to do is set this axis mode to be absolute. So this is essentially the pivot point. And when it's set to absolute, we can change what the pivot point is. We just want to leave this at 0, 0, so it's in the center of the screen. Instead of manually trying to figure out what the spacing is and then having to change it when we update the amount of copies, let's use an expression to make this really easy. If you right click on the Z rotation, go down to expression, we can do 360 degrees, which is the total distance of the circle, and we're going to divide this by the amount of copies. That way, this short expression is able to figure out the exact distance it needs to put between each one of those little dots. So now when I change the amount of copies, it'll always be perfectly centered. So let's crank this up to something like 50. I'm going to go back to the S ellipse and make these dots a bit smaller. All right, so this is really cool and easy to set up, but sometimes I like to take this a step further and add in a second duplicate node. Before we do that, let's go to the first duplicate node and drop the count down to 4. Now, right after the shape, we're going to add in another duplicate node and set the copies to be 6. Again, we need to set the axis mode to be absolute, and instead of using an expression, we're just going to do this manually. Now, instead of having perfectly spaced dots, we have a few clusters of dots that are perfectly spaced around the circle. To recenter this, we'll add in a S transform after that duplicate node, and using the rotation, we can make it so that these are perfectly centered. And a trick to do that, if you click in a viewer, you can do Control G, and that'll add the frame guides. So we can zoom in and rotate this until the middle circle is centered on that frame guide, so it's centered in the screen. And then Control G to take that away. Now we can go to the original duplicate node and change the copies to add in some really cool detail. Okay, let's add in another accent. I'm gonna grab our original circle, copy it, and paste it off to the side. Then we're gonna merge this up after this transform node. So if I just connect this to the output, it'll automatically create a merge. In the viewer, I'm gonna grab this control and drag it down so it's in the same area as our dots. Then inside the inspector, I want to grab this length slider and drag this down. And what this is going to do is shorten the length of our actual line. When working with thin lines like this, sometimes the viewer controls can cover it up and it's kind of hard to see what's going on. For that, what you can do is click in the viewer and do Control K, and that's going to hide all of the controls. If you don't want to use the keyboard shortcut, you can also click these 3 dots and then select Show Controls. Back in the ellipse node, we also want to set the cap style to be flat so it doesn't have that rounded edge. Now, using the position and length, we're going to get this position in between those dots, so that way we have dots, line, and it just duplicates that all around. To finish off the design of this graphic, there is one more element that I want to add in, and that is the S-engon node. This node allows you to specify the amount of sides a shape has. Using this, I want to create 4 triangles that are spread around the circle. You should remember how to do this, but just to review, we're going to add in a duplicate node right after this, and then merge this up into our main merge. Before we play around with those duplicate settings, we're going to add in that expression on the height and width for the engon node, shrink this down to be a small size, and then use the X offset to move it off to the side. Then inside of that duplicate node, we're going to set the copies to be 4, come down to the axis mode, set this to be absolute, and use the same expression that we had before, 360 divided by copies. Awesome, so we have a really good looking design, but it is missing one important thing, and that is the animation. For circle elements, I don't like to make on and off animations. Instead, I just like to add some continuous movement to them and then animate them on when we're compositing the effects in the next video. So there's 3 different animations that I want to add: a constant loop, some random motion, and a flicker animation. Let's start with the first one since it's the easiest, and we're actually not going to use any keyframes for these animations. This is where it becomes really important to make sure all of our elements are separated. Instead of having to go in and reorganize everything, all we need to do is add in a S transform after this first merge, and we can control the rotation of the outer circle separate from everything else. To animate this, you can use keyframes, and that's what I do a lot of the time, but there is a better way. Since this is just going to be a constant animation that we want to go on forever, we can use an expression to animate it for us. If we right click on the rotation control and add in another expression, what we want to do is, pay attention here, it gets really complicated, type time. And that's it. That's really how simple it is. So every single frame, it's going to add another degree of rotation to our graphic. It's just going to create this infinite loop like we have here. There's a few things that we can do to modify this. The first thing is just making it negative so that way it goes clockwise, and the other thing, we can multiply or divide it to change the speed. In this case, I want to slow it down a bit, so I'm going to do divided by 2. You see how this is a bit easier than using keyframes? Yeah, expressions are awesome. Let's talk about the next animation, and this is adding in some random motion, in this case, some spin. This one we're going to apply to the dots and line elements, and to do this, we're just going to add in another S transform right after that. Again, instead of manually animating the spin, changing the speed and direction, we're going to right click on the rotation and modify this with the perturb modifier. Up in the modifiers tab, we have a few new controls, and the main one here that we want to look at is strength. This will specify the range that our element can rotate. So for example, if we do 10, it can rotate from anywhere from -5 to 5. For heads-up display elements, I usually like to set this to be something like 45 degrees. Then using the speed and wobble controls, we can change how fast we want this and how chaotic it'll be. My preference is a quick but smooth animation, which is pretty much the default that we get out of this modifier. Great, so now we just have one more element to animate and one animation type left. How convenient. I want these triangles to stay in the same spot but flicker on and off every now and then. But just like the last two, I don't want to manually animate this. For this one, we're also going to be using an expression. It's still pretty easy to understand, but not quite as simple as the last one. In the S Engon node, we're going to come to Style and animate this opacity slider. So right click to expression, and since this is going to be random, we're going to start with the random expression. By the way, I have a free page on my website with my Fusion expression cheat sheet, so if you're interested in learning more or always forget what each expression does, then check that out, link down below. The random function will return an integer value between the values that I put in here. So if I do 0, 2, it's going to do 0, 1, or 2. So in this case, I don't want it to go to 2, so I'm just going to bring this down to be 1, and now that's going to create a flickering animation. This is a little bit too fast. I want it to be on more than it is off. Since we just have two numbers here, it's about a 50-50 chance for it to be 0 or 1. So to fix that, we could just make the second number even bigger. So if I set this to be 5, you can see it's going to be solid a lot more than it is going to be transparent. And since opacity sliders don't do anything above 1, just to make sure we don't run into any issues, we're going to come down here and we're going to add in a minimum expression. So minimum between random, and then we'll do comma and 1. So if something's greater than 1, it'll just return that 1 value. So now to change the intensity of this flicker effect, we can just change the number in this random expression. So if I do 10, it's going to be even less often that it'll disappear. And then if you want it to be more frequent, you can lower this number down to something like 1 or 2. Again, expressions are awesome. Imagine having to manually keyframe this for the entire clip. That should give you a good idea of how to build circle elements, and you'll have to take these and make some of your own, and if you make some cool designs, make sure to tag me on Twitter so I can check them out. Now let's take what we've learned so far and build on that to make some chart graphics, starting at the simplest possible spot with a rectangle that has a thin border. Instead of this just being a plain rectangle, I want two of the corners to have a diagonal effect, so I'm going to cut the top off here, and that way it just gives it a kind of cool futuristic look. So since we can't do this with a rectangle node, the actual frame is going to be drawn using a S polygon, which means our S rectangle is actually just going to be our temporary reference node. So using the S polygon, we're going to zoom in and trace out this rectangle. Once we trace it out, we can bring the border width up to be exactly the same, and now we can just delete our original rectangle. We also want to make sure that this is not solid, and now we can go ahead and start creating our design. So if we zoom in here, down a little ways, we're going to add in a point. Then we're going to grab this top point, hold down Shift, and drag it to the right. Holding down Shift makes it so I can only move it on one axis. So since I started moving in the X direction, I can only move it on the X axis. Then you can zoom out, take a look at it. In this case, let's make this a little bit stronger. We're going to drag this one down, again, holding Shift, so that way I can only move it in the Y direction. When you're done with that side, go to the opposite corner and do exactly the same thing. When creating graphics, especially stuff like graphs, it's a good idea to plan ahead to make stuff easier. Since I want to have multiple sliders on this and animate each one of them individually, it'll change how I build the actual element. So to build these, let's start with the back part of the slider, and to do that, we're going to add in a S rectangle. We'll create a new merge node right after this S polygon, and we want this width to be exactly the same as the thickness on our line. Then we're going to drop the height so that way it totally fits inside of that frame. To control and indicate the slider's value, we're going to be using a S ellipse node. And instead of connecting this into this main merge, we're actually going to make a new merge right after this line. Inside of the S ellipse, we'll come to the height, add an expression, and connect this into the width to make it really small. Then using this Y offset, we'll actually be able to change the value of the slider. Below the circle, I want the line to be solid, indicating that the slider is up. And above the line, I want it to be somewhat transparent. So to do that, let's go into our S rectangle, go to the style, and bring the opacity down to say 0.5. We also want to label these to make it easier to understand what's going on. So with the node selected, press F2, we're going to call this first one back line. Then the circle we can call slider dot. To make part of the solid, we're going to duplicate this back line, connect this up into the merge node, and call this one front line. Inside of this one, we want the opacity to be 1, and we're going to use some expressions to make this really easy. Again, we're going to hide the viewer controls just so we can see what is going on. First, we want to make sure no matter what the height of this line is, it's always below the circle. So we need to center it at the bottom. So right click on the Y offset and do expression. Then we're going to subtract back line dot height, and we're going to do divided by 2. What that's going to do is put the center of this line at the bottom of the back line. Now, to make it so it doesn't extend in the bottom, what we need to do is just add the height of this line divided by 2. Now this line is going to start at the bottom, and when we change it, it's going to go up the back line that we already created. To get this to match the circle, we just need to reference that node. So in the expression, we're going to do slider dot, and then we're going to do dot translate dot y. To figure out what you need to type in here, if you click on a node and hover over the control you want to reference, down on the bottom left, it's going to tell you exactly that. Now, in this case, it's not exactly working. You can see as I bring the Y offset up, it'll start drawing the line, but as I bring it down past the halfway point, there's just no line at all. And that's because in the coordinate system, 0 is the center. But we need to tell this line that 0 is when the dot is all the way at the bottom. So the way to fix this is we need to tell this line that when this circle is at 0, it actually needs to be half of the line. So if we just come in the expression box and do plus backline.height divided by 2. And now this is going to look correct, and when we move the slider around, everything is going to update properly. Let's move all this around to organize it, and right at the end we're going to add in a S transform so that way we can use this to move the slider back and forth. To make everything nice and neat, we're going to select these nodes, do shift space, and type underlay. This will add in a nice organizer that we can move all the nodes at the same time, and if we want to label this, we can hold down Alt to just click on the underlay, and then do F2, and we're going to call this slider 1. Let's move this up a ways. We're going to copy this and paste in 5 versions. We then want to go through and connect all of these up into our main merge node. Now we need to reposition them so they're not all stacked on top of each other, and slider 3 is going to be the middle, so we don't need to touch that one. Moving up to slider 2, let's click on this S transform, and we just want to offset this to the left to get some nice spacing. Instead of manually trying to match the spacing on all 4 of the other sliders, we're just going to go to the transform in this one and use another expression. On the X offset, add in an expression, and we want to reference this S transform node down here. So let's type the name of it, S transform 1 underscore 1. Then since we're referencing the same control, instead of typing it out, we can actually just hit this plus icon and it'll add in the name of that control. Now those two are linked, but we don't want it in the same spot. We want it even further to the left. So let's just multiply this by 2, and that moves it over perfectly. I'm going to copy this expression, go all the way down to slider 5, paste this into the X offset, but instead of having it positive, we're going to make it negative. We'll do the same thing for slider 4, but instead of multiplying by 2, we'll just leave it as is. In slider 2, I can move this X offset and it updates all of them. Inside of the slider dot nodes, we can go through and move these so that way they are all at a different value. If we want to animate this, we're going to use the perturb modifier just like we did with a circle. The strength is going to be set to whatever you set the backline height to. So in this case, 0.4. So in the strength slider, I want this to be 0.4. We also want to make sure this value is at 0 so that way it doesn't extend way too far past it. Then I'm going to go through on each of these, making sure to modify it with a perturb modifier, setting the strength to be 0.4, and then hitting reseed so that way they're not all exactly the same. When I think of heads-up displays, I always see some random letters that are always changing, just like you would see throughout like the Matrix movies. To do this, we can actually use the S text node right inside of the shape system. First, we're just going to add in a bunch of random letters, and these don't actually matter at all, but it'll dictate how many characters we'll have in the final animation. Then you'll right-click on the text box and come down to Text Scramble. Under the Modifiers tab down here as the substitute characters, this is what is actually going to be shown. So I like to use all of the different symbols on my keyboard, and then I also like to add in all of the numbers as well. Then just set this randomness to be 1, and on every frame it's going to give us a bunch of random characters. But we can make this look a little bit better. Back on the Tools tab, let's set the style to be light, and then we can use the anchor controls to put this down in the bottom left. Now I'm going to move this down into the bottom part of our graphic and then change the size and the tracking until we get something that looks really good. Awesome, that looks great. And one more thing to add is a futuristic barcode design that we can make inside of the shape system. For this, we're going to start with a S rectangle, and we want to make this really thin and then really short as well. Then right after this, we're going to add in a S grid node. And using this, we're going to set the cells Y to be 1 and then the X offset to be smaller, so that way these are right next to each other. Then using the X count, we can drag this up to make this barcode as long as we want. To add some variation, we're going to come after this S grid and add in the S jitter node. Using this, we're going to grab the shape Y size and drag the low value down until we get something that looks really good. Right now, this is going to be static on all the frames, but if we set the jitter mode to be random, it'll pick a new value to set to each of those on every frame. Finally, let's add in a S transform right after that and connect this into the merge node. We can then position this anywhere down in the bottom of our graphic. In this case, it's too long, so we can come back up to the S grid and then just bring down this count until we get something that fits. Then to finish this up, there's two final things that we can do. The first thing is grabbing our original polygon and making a copy of this. We're going to connect this up and come through and make sure that all this is just a little bit longer. So we can grab this and drag some of the points out to give a little bit of a gap. We're going to come up to the top, grab these 2 points, drag these up to give that same gap. Then we'll just need to modify these points to make sure that all of that still looks good. And now what we can do in the second polygon node is bring this length down and just add in some accents that are just around the corners here. We can duplicate this as many times as we want, placing these all around the frame. Then add in even more detail, add in some more S polygon nodes to make those same accents we did in the circle effects. Not only does this look cool, but it gives good continuity between our designs. And these can take a while to make since you need a bunch of variation in each design and you need multiple designs for your final project. So to save you some time, I created a pack with 50 of these for just $5. This includes 20-second versions of the animated elements already rendered with an alpha channel, so you can just drop it in your project and it's ready to go. If you do not want it to be animated, there's also a static image of each element and a .setting file for each one of these, so that we can just drag it in your project, edit it, and maybe just take some time to look at how I made some of these different designs. There's a few hidden things in there that I did not talk about in today's video. In next week's video, not only are we going to talk about tracking and compositing, but we're also going to cover adding color and glow to these to give them the digital look. So make sure to subscribe and click here to watch the next video.